All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be talking about something that I know is on a lot of people's minds, especially if you're a parent or a student in Switzerland. And that is preparing for the Swiss Gymnasium entrance exam.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you guys have sent us tons of material, lots of great information about this really important step in the Swiss education system. And we're going to do our best to kind of, break it down for you and look at the different paths that are possible, the exam structure itself, and, how you can actually prepare for it.
Yeah.
So, at the end of this, hopefully you feel like you've got a good grasp of what to expect and feel a little bit more confident about navigating the whole process.
For sure.
So let's just jump right in. I guess maybe, just to start off, maybe you could give us a quick rundown of kind of the main options that are out there when it comes to, the different types of gymnasium.
Right, yeah. So I think the most common one that probably most people are familiar with is the long-term gymnasium.
Right.
This is the one that you typically enter after 6th grade, so around 12 years old. And it's a 6-year program. And at the end, you get the Matura, which is basically the Swiss high school diploma that then allows you to go to university.
Yeah, that's the main goal, right, is to kind of get that ticket to the university system.
Exactly. But then there's also the short-term gymnasium, sometimes called Kurzgymi.
Kurzgymi, okay.
That one usually starts a little later, so when you're around 14 or 15, kind of in the 2nd or 3rd grade of lower secondary. And that one's only a 4-year program. But you still end up with a Matura at the end, so it's kind of like a second chance, or maybe for people who, develop a little bit later academically.
Gotcha. So a few different ways to get to that same end goal. Okay, interesting.
Exactly. And, and it's not even just those two. There are other options as well, like the Handelsmittelschule, HMS, or the Festmittelschule, FMS, which often have very similar entrance requirements.
Right. So it's like a whole family of kind of secondary school options.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, you mentioned something earlier that I think is really important, and that's the differences between cantons. So, it's not like there's one national exam, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's kind of a really important part of the Swiss system.
Right.
There's a huge emphasis on the cantons having their own autonomy, and that definitely applies to education.
Right, it's very decentralized.
Yeah, so what you need to know to get into a gymnasium in Zurich is probably going to be quite different from what you need in Bern or Basel.
So really the key takeaway here, I guess, is that you really have to look into the specific regulations for your canton. There's no point in studying a bunch of stuff that's not even going to be on your exam.
Right, yeah, totally. You really need to tailor your preparation.
Okay, cool. So let's get into the exam itself then. And maybe we can use Zurich as an example since, we have a lot of information about that one. So for the long-term Gymi, I think you said it's called ZAP1.
That's right, yeah.
What does that exam actually look like? Like, what are the subjects? How long is it? That kind of thing.
Right, so for ZP1, you're looking at basically 2 main subjects, which are mathematics and German.
Okay, classic Gymi subjects, I guess.
Yep, pretty much. So for mathematics, you've got a 60-minute exam that covers things like arithmetic, algebra, geometry, all the usual suspects.
Mm-hmm.
And then for German, it's split into 2 parts. There's a 60-minute essay writing section, and then another 45 minutes for text comprehension and language analysis.
Okay, so quite a bit of writing involved there.
Yeah, definitely. And if you're going for the short-term Gymi, or ZAP2, as it's called, it's actually pretty similar. But you get a little bit more time for the mathematics and the German writing. And then on top of that, there's also a 60-minute written French exam.
Ah, okay. So French gets added in for the short-term track.
Exactly.
Gotcha. So I'm assuming this whole exam is based on the material that you learn in primary school and lower secondary.
It is, yeah. But I think it's important to note that the level of difficulty is definitely a step up from what you're used to in regular school, so you will need to do some extra separation.
Right, so you can't just coast on your schoolwork.
Exactly, yeah.
You got to actually put in the work.
For sure. And then there's also the scoring system to consider, which is a little bit unique.
Oh, right, yeah. How does that work?
So in Zurich, they actually combine your entrance exam grades with your grades from your last school report. Those are called experience grades, or Vornote.
Vornote, okay.
Yeah. So for the long-term Gymi in public schools, it's a 50-50 split between the exam and the Vornote. And you generally need a final grade of at least 4.75 to pass.
Okay.
But if you're applying to a private school, they might weigh the exam more heavily.
Gotcha. So it can vary a bit.
Yeah. And then for the short-term Gymi, they take the average of your exam grades, with math being 40%, German 40%, and French 20%. And then they combine that with your Vorna from several subjects, including German, math, French, English, and nature and technology.
Wow, so they really take a comprehensive look at your academic record.
Yeah, it's pretty thorough. And then there's one more thing, which is the oral exam.
Oh, right, you mentioned that earlier. So not everyone has to do the oral exam.
No, not necessarily. It's mainly for students applying to the short-term Gymi in Zurich, and only if their written exam average is a little bit below the passing threshold.
So it's like a second chance sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's like an opportunity to prove that you actually have the skills, even if you didn't quite make it on the written exams.
Okay, and what subjects are covered in the oral exam?
It's usually just math, German, and French. And if you can get a 4.0 or higher on the oral exam, that can actually bump you up enough to get admitted.
Interesting. So there's still hope, even if you don't ace the written part.
Exactly.
Okay, great. So now that we have a better sense of the exam itself, let's talk about preparation. Where do you even begin with something like this?
Well, I think the first thing is to be realistic about the timeline.
Right.
Experts recommend starting at least 6 months before the exams, which are typically in March.
Okay, 6 months. That's a pretty significant chunk of time.
Yeah, and to be honest, even starting earlier can be beneficial, especially if you're not a native speaker of one of the exam languages.
Right, that makes sense. You need more time to get up to speed.
Exactly. And of course, it's really important to maintain good grades in school leading up to the exam because remember, those Vornote count for a lot.
Right, don't slack off just because you're studying for the Gymi exam.
Exactly.
So once you have a timeline in mind, what's the next step?
Well, I think it's really helpful to sit down with your child and work together to create a structured study plan.
Okay, a study plan. So like actually scheduling in specific study time.
Exactly. And there's a really useful document called the Prüfungsanforderungen that outlines all the topics that will be covered on the exam.
Okay, so that's a good starting point.
Yeah, definitely. And when you're making your plan, try to aim to finish all the core learning material about 4 weeks before the exam.
So you have time for review.
Exactly. It's also a good idea to break down the material into smaller, more manageable chunks and be realistic about how much time you can dedicate to studying each day. And don't forget to schedule in regular breaks.
Breaks are important. You don't want to burn yourself out.
Exactly.
So, okay, you've got your timeline, you've got your study plan, but what about the actual studying itself? What are some effective techniques that students can use?
Well, I think one of the most important things is to focus on active learning.
Active learning, okay. So not just passively reading through a textbook.
Right, exactly. You want to be engaging with the material. So things like creating mind maps, using flashcards, trying to explain concepts in your own words, or finding real-world examples can be really helpful.
Okay, so make it interactive.
Yeah, definitely. And then another really powerful technique is spaced repetition.
Spaced repetition, what's that?
So basically, it's a way of reviewing material at increasing intervals.
Oh, interesting. So like you review something the next day, then a few days later, then a week later, and so on.
Exactly. And that helps to really cement the information in your long-term memory.
Okay, that makes sense.
Another crucial part of preparation is practicing under exam conditions.
Right, because it's a very specific type of pressure.
Exactly. And the good news is that you can often find past papers online.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the Canton of Zurich, for example, has a whole archive of past exams on their website.
Okay, that's really useful.
It is. And then finally, I think it's really important to have a dedicated study space that's quiet and free of distractions.
Right, so you can really focus.
Exactly.
Now, I know we talked about the subjects that are covered in the exam, but are there any specific tips for, math, German, and French?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, what should students be focusing on?
Well, for math, it's really all about building a strong foundation in arithmetic, algebra, and geometry.
The basics, yeah.
Exactly. And then you just want to practice, practice, practice. Do as many different types of problems as you can, including word problems.
Right, because those can be tricky.
They can be. And again, working through those old Gymi papers can be really helpful for seeing how the concepts are applied in exam questions.
Okay, good tip. What about German?
For German, I think the most important thing is to read as widely as possible.
Okay, so expose yourself to different styles of writing.
Exactly. And then, of course, practice writing regularly, especially essays, and really focus on things like structure, style, spelling, and punctuation.
Right, those little details matter.
They do. It's also a good idea to review your grammar rules and do some language analysis exercises.
Okay, sounds pretty comprehensive.
And if you're not a native German speaker, immersion is key. Watch German movies, listen to German music, try to speak German as much as possible.
Right, surround yourself with the language.
Exactly.
And then lastly, French. I know that's only required for the short-term Gymi.
Right. And the key there is really to focus on text comprehension, language observation, and writing.
Okay.
And if you happen to be in a canton where there's an oral exam, like Bern or potentially Basel, then you'll need to practice your speaking and listening skills as well. But again, it really all comes down to tailoring your preparation to the specific requirements of your canton.
Right, check those regulations.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. Now, one thing I'm wondering about is time management. I mean, it must be really challenging for students to balance their regular schoolwork with all this extra studying for the Gymi exam.
Oh, absolutely. It's a lot to juggle.
So, any advice on that front?
Yeah, I think the key is to be really organized and to try to integrate your Gimme preparation into your existing schedule as much as possible. So, look for pockets of time where you can squeeze in some studying, even if it's just for 15 or 20 minutes, and learn to prioritize tasks.
Right, so not everything has to be done perfectly.
Exactly. It's more important to focus on the things that will actually move the needle.
Make the most of your time.
Yeah, and there are lots of time management tools out there that can help you stay on track, like, digital calendars, planners, that kind of thing.
Oh yeah, those can be really helpful.
They can be. And it's also just important to be realistic about your workload and not try to cram everything in at the last minute. And don't forget about your regular school assignments.
Right, those still matter.
They do, and if you can, build in some buffer time just in case things take longer than you expect.
Okay, good advice. So, we've talked about the structure of the exam, the preparation process, time management, but what about some of the other challenges that students might face? Like, I know test anxiety is a big one for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how can students deal with that?
Well, one of the best things you can do is practice taking the exam under timed conditions.
Right, so you get used to that pressure.
Exactly. And try to use positive self-talk. Remind yourself that you've prepared well and that you're capable of doing this.
Okay, so like a mental pep talk.
Exactly. And there are also some relaxation techniques that can be helpful, like deep breathing or mindfulness exercises.
Right, just to kind of calm those nerves.
Exactly. And it's also important to remember that mistakes are part of the learning process. Don't beat yourself up if you get something wrong. Just try to learn from it and move on. And if the anxiety is really severe, don't be afraid to seek professional help.
Right, there's no shame in that. Okay, so what about, students who have maybe one subject that they struggle with more than others? Like, what can they do to really strengthen those weaker areas?
Well, the first step is to identify those weaknesses early on, maybe through practice tests or just by paying attention to your grades in school.
Okay, so know where you need to focus.
Exactly. And then once you know what those weaker areas are, dedicate more study time to them.
Okay, makes sense.
And don't be afraid to ask for extra help. Talk to your teachers, form study groups with your classmates, or even consider getting a tutor.
Right, utilize all the resources that are available.
Exactly. And sometimes it's just about breaking down those complex concepts into smaller, more manageable pieces.
Right, so it doesn't feel so overwhelming.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to try different learning methods. What works for one person might not work for another. And finally, be sure to monitor your progress regularly. Take little quizzes, do practice problems, and celebrate those small victories along the way.
Right, because that can be really motivating.
It can be.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of different aspects of preparing for the Gymi exam, but what about resources? I mean, are there any specific books or websites or programs that you would recommend?
Yeah, there are definitely some really helpful resources out there.
Okay, like what?
Well, first of all, I would say that past exams and practice materials are absolutely invaluable.
Right, we talked about that a bit.
And you can usually find those on the website of your cantonal education department.
Okay,
There are also some commercial preparation books that can be helpful.
okay.
Like there's one called Ich Willens Gymi, which is pretty popular.
Okay, H-Willens Gymi. Got it.
And you can also find practice tests and quizzes online. Then, another option is to consider tutoring or preparation courses.
Right.
But I think it's important to be really careful about which ones you choose.
Okay, so like what should people look for?
Well, I think it's important to look for programs that are transparent about their methods and that have qualified teachers and good materials.
Right, so you're not just wasting your money.
Exactly. And it's also important to think about the learning environment.
Right, like is it a good fit for you?
Exactly. Do you prefer a small group setting or one-on-one tutoring, that kind of thing? And tutoring can get pretty expensive, so it's always worth checking to see if there are any free options available through public schools or community centers.
Okay, yeah, good point. Save some money.
Exactly. And then, of course, there are also all sorts of online platforms and tools that can supplement your learning.
Right, like Khan Academy.
Yeah, Khan Academy is great for math. There are also tons of language learning apps, online tutoring platforms, you name it. And the nice thing about online resources is that they're often much more affordable than traditional tutoring or prep courses.
Right, and you can do them on your own time.
Exactly.
Okay, great. So we've covered a lot of ground today, but I think there's one last really important thing to touch on, and that's, the importance of taking care of yourself throughout this whole process.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, it's a lot of pressure, it's a lot of work, and it can be really easy to neglect your well-being.
Yeah, definitely. It's so important to make sure that you're getting enough sleep.
Yeah, sleep is crucial.
It is. Try to maintain a consistent sleep schedule, even on weekends, and aim for at least 8 hours a night.
Right, that's what they always say.
Yeah, and then physical activity is also really important for managing stress and staying focused.
Okay, so make time for some exercise.
Exactly, even if it's just a quick walk around the block.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, nutrition plays a big role.
Yeah, got to fuel that brain.
Exactly, so make sure you're eating a balanced diet and staying hydrated. And then also make time for breaks and hobbies.
Right, don't forget to have some fun.
Exactly. It's not all about studying. And finally, I think it's really important to have open communication with your family and friends about how you're feeling. Don't be afraid to ask for help or support if you need it.
Right, talk about it.
Exactly.
Okay, so just to kind of wrap things up here, I think it's clear that the Swiss Gymnasium entrance exam is a pretty significant step, but it's definitely manageable.
Yeah.
With a clear plan and a focused approach to preparation, and by really taking care of yourself throughout the process, I think you can definitely feel confident and ready to tackle this challenge.
Absolutely.
So just to kind of recap what we've talked about today, we started by looking at the different pathways to the gymnasium, the long-term, the short-term, and some of those other options. And then we delved into the structure of the entrance exam itself, using Zurich as an example, talking about the subjects that are covered, the timing, the scoring system. And then we spent a lot of time talking about practical strategies for effective studying, like active learning, spaced repetition, practice under exam conditions.
Right.
And we also touched on some really important aspects like time management and how to overcome challenges like test anxiety or weak areas.
For sure.
We also discussed some useful resources that are available to students, like past exams, preparation books, tutoring programs, online platforms.
Yeah,
And then, of course, we emphasized the importance of maintaining your well-being throughout this whole process.
definitely.
And, I think one of the key takeaways from our deep dive today is that the specific requirements for the gymnasium entrance exam can vary quite a bit from canton to canton. So before you start studying, it's absolutely crucial to do your research and make sure you understand exactly what's expected of you in your particular canton.
Eh.
And then finally, I just want to say that, while the gymnasium is a great option for many students, it's not the only path to success in the Swiss education system. There are many other valuable pathways available, and the skills you've developed while preparing for this exam will serve you well no matter what direction you choose to go in.
That's very true.
So if you want to learn more about the gymnasium entrance exam and the specific regulations in your canton, be sure to check out the official websites of your canton education department. They often have really valuable information about the exam process, past papers, and other resources that can be really helpful.
For sure.
So yeah, I think that's about it for today. What about you? What stands out to you as the most important thing that students should keep in mind as they're preparing for this exam?
I think for me, it all boils down to starting early, creating a structured study plan, and then sticking to it as much as possible.
Right, consistency is key.
It is, but also don't forget to take care of yourself along the way.
Yeah, that's great advice.
Get enough sleep, eat well, exercise, and make time for things you enjoy.
Absolutely.
Because at the end of the day, your well-being is the most important thing.
Couldn't agree more. All right, well, that's all the time we have for today.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
My pleasure.
And best of luck to all those students out there who are preparing for the gymnasium entrance exam.
Yes, good luck.
We're rooting for you.